Just doing a little video here on BWL guides. I've been looking at quite a few of them in order to prepare my guild. There are some good ones. All of them are pretty good, but none of them are perfect. So what I've done is I've gone ahead and picked my favorite. I think it's the most well-rounded, and I'm going to fill in commentary where I think things have been glossed over or bits that need elaboration. It's nothing to detract from the video itself. It's a great video, and I think SpeaktoRyan did a great job, but I do think there are some parts that can be elaborated a little bit. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So I'll be playing the video, and then I will go ahead and pause and comment where necessary. Hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. So let's go.
And thank you so much for tuning in. This is an easy, quick, general guide for each boss fight in Blackwing Lair. This is not a full Blackwing Lair strategy, but is something you can quickly reference before each fight in Blackwing Lair if you need a once-over on what to do. You can check the description below for links to each specific boss strategy within this video. Remember that there are multiple strategies for certain bosses, and that this is just what has worked for us. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. Otherwise, have a wonderful day and good luck in Blackwing Lair. Razor Gore. You need great DPS for this fight, so use consumables here. For phase 1, place the range DPS.
Use consumables everywhere. They're consumables for a reason.
Yes, and spare healers in the center of the room. Have a tank and heals and evenly split DPS in each corner. There are 2 adds or 1 dragon that spawn every 15 seconds or so. The kill order should be mages first, then dragons, then legionnaires. When a dragon spawns, call it out and have range DPS that are in the center focus on that dragon. For example, Dragon West, Dragon East, etc. The designated orb controller, which is typically a tank or hunter who can feign, uses Razor Gore to break the eggs. Once there are only 2 eggs left.
Okay, so yes, basically all correct. There is a secondary strategy here where if if your raid comp is more heavily stacked towards ranged, you can have all of your people basically line up in front of the, I guess you call it balcony, where the orb is being controlled, and then you let the other corners, the far corners, come to you. You have your warriors intercept or whatever, and you kill them there. Important thing to note is that, sorry, my dog's being gross. Roland, stop. Important thing to note is that a lot of strategies will tell you to kite the dragonkin, and they'll tell you, have hunters help with frost traps, and then have a warrior spec'd into piercing howl, kind of kite them around the room. Not necessary if your DPS is on point. They're not that beefy, and if they could be reliably killed on private servers with inflated health and armor values, they can be killed in Classic. Just make sure that your ranged DPS are quick about transitioning whenever a dragon spawns, and that you're very clear on your callouts of where they're spawning from. Additionally, a thing here is to remember that damage will break the channel from whoever is controlling Razor Gore. So it's very important to have 1 or 2 priests on designated powered shield duty for the orb controllers. Keep a shield on them pretty much at all times, so any incidental damage that may happen doesn't break them out of it. If worst case scenario, both of them get hit, there's a 90-second cooldown on the orb, or using the orb. Nobody can control Razor Gore, and then you just wipe. Last thing would be that the reason you're having either a tank or a hunter control the orb is that you're going to get primary aggro. Whoever breaks the last egg is going to get a ton of aggro. I think it's permanent from Razor Gore himself. So if it's a tank, great. And if it's a hunter, they can just feign and drop that right off. You don't really need tanks per se for the adds in the beginning. Any decently geared Fury Warrior will be able to hold them. Also, they're CCable, stunnable, mages and whatnot, who are doing the bulk of the damage, so feel free to intercept, gouge, kitty shot, whatever. Anyways.
Stack behind the pillar on the south side. Give the tank a second to gain aggro, And pop your greater fire protection potions now.
Okay, highly disagree with this. Greater fire protection potion should be popped well in advance so that you have your potion cooldown as melee for free action potions. Razor Gore does a fairly sizable War Stomp mechanic. I think it's 4 or 5 seconds to stun, and this affects everybody around him. So both tanks and DPS, melee DPS, should have their fire protection potions up, and then, before you go in, treat it kind of like you would Gehennis, where you pop it pre-getting in melee range, and take a big chunk out of them right at first. This also helps keep your tanks alive, because they don't lose all their mitigation or their avoidance when they get stunned. So again, pop your greater fire protection potions earlier, and then pop a free action potion heading into this.
This part is not a race, it's a marathon. Do not pass your tank's threat. And before the fireball, melee should be getting out and dodging behind that same pillar.
Yeah, he's correct about that, and this is kind of a theme that you're going to see throughout all of BWL. DPS just got to keep their dicks in their pants. Like, there are some TPS checks, and if you got people just not even caring about threat, not looking at their meters, not listening, they're going to pull, they're going to die, and more often than not, they're going to wipe the raid doing it, or at least take a chunk out of it. So DPS, just be very careful about how much threat you're pushing out, and which is extremely important because we're heading into Veil, which is probably where it's most visible. So
for Veil Straws, you're going to position every healer and ranged in a tight stack behind the square where the melee stand. Have your main tank positioned right in front of her with the 2 other tanks.
Important note, I know you probably all know this, Veil Straws will not be hostile to you as you enter the room, so you can feel free to position perfectly prior to pull. This is actually my ideal setup. I think it's probably the best one. And his overall coverage of Veil is going to be very good. There are like 2-3 things, mostly regarding tanking, that we can elaborate on. So,
Positioned on the opposite side of her from the melee group. Have the melee position to the right of her back right leg, about 5 yards out. Everyone is going to get a debuff that essentially gives everyone endless mana, rage, or energy. Every 15 seconds, Veil is going to target a mana user.
Okay, so melee positioning here, it's basically Oni, except Veil Straws' cleave. It chains, and it chains hard. So make sure that you're in the correct position, because if you're too far up, even if it doesn't look like you're in front of her, you're still going to catch a cleave chained onto you, and if that happens, it will hit everyone. And that's just extra raid damage that doesn't need to happen. So make sure that you are right where he says, right about that back right leg, so that you're not wiping your raid.
With a debuff called Burning Adrenaline. It's similar to the Baron Geddon Bomb in Molten Core, except instead of a time limit, it removes 5% of your health per second. When you die, you explode. When ranged get this, they immediately need to run to the back corner of the room, to the left from where you came in, and essentially let the debuff kill them there. Every 45 seconds, however, the person with the highest threat, assuming it's the tank, will also get this debuff. The other tanks need to be ready to grab Veil as soon as the main tank goes down.
Okay, so this is the first thing. What you just saw happen, first tank gets the debuff, dies, he turns, Veil Straws, he or she, I don't know, turns to the secondary threat target, who is across from the melee, and in doing so, tail swipes the entire melee pack. The way you avoid this is that you have your secondary tank time it. So as soon as the main tank is ostensibly going to go down, secondary tank, whoever's second on threat, needs to move to the front of Veil Straws so that this doesn't happen. This is a very good group, but a single tail swipe can throw off DPS enough that it will result in a wipe. So try and get it cleaner, where the second tank can really get that timing down right so she doesn't really move, or he doesn't really move at all.
From this. If the tank dies before getting Burning Adrenaline, the fight is essentially lost. Everyone, especially melee, need to watch their threat here carefully. If someone pulls, it's almost impossible to recover. Rogues particularly need to utilize Vanish to dump their threat and use Feint on every single cooldown.
Yeah. Okay. So, coming off of that last note about threat for melee DPS, rogues spot on. Fury warriors. If your tank is having TPS problems, if your dick is just massive, you can spam cleave instead of heroic strike. Doesn't have the threat modifier, so it'll give them some breathing room. Obviously, it's not ideal, and you do want to work towards a point where your tank is pumping out enough TPS that you can basically go whole hog. But maybe that doesn't happen, and if it does, you need to adjust accordingly. Tanks themselves should be running the fastest daggers they can and machine gunning out heroic strikes here. So that's either going to be an Alcor's main hand or a Finkel's Skinner, which is obviously more affordable. There is some argument for Escanders, but lack of available... Escanders is just garbage. Like, a lot of people thought that because of private server proc per minute values, it was going to be great in Classic, but the PPM on it is terrible. And so you'll probably get more value out of the 1.3 daggers over the entire course of the fight than you would from an Escanders with like 1 or 2 procs. Additionally, for tanking here, if you're getting started, it's almost a given that whoever starts tanking the fight is gonna die. So ideally, the way you would have this is that whoever will be tanking Broodlord does not main tank Veilstraws. And this is so that you can preserve world buffs on whoever that's going to be. So hopefully you can be killing Veilstraws before your second tank dies. So what you're going to do is you're going to have your second strongest tank start the fight on Veil. They're going to get the debuff. They're going to die. And then your main tank steps in, finishes the fight, maintains world buffs for Suppression Room and Broodlord. This is important because Broodlord does truck. He hits pretty hard. And so it's important that you have as many world buffs as possible on whoever's tanking him.
For the Suppression Room, you need to continuously be moving. Have 1 to 2 of your rogues continuously disarming the traps so you don't suffer movement reductions. Those rogues shouldn't be in combat, preferably staying in stealth, and should only focus on the traps. Do not single target the whelps. Have 1 tank assigned to holding aggro.
Okay, he says it briefly, but gotta put some emphasis on it. Do not single target the whelps. What ends up happening is kind of like the dog pack situation before Magmadar. If you if you gather and kill a full wave of whelps all at once, it gives your healers and casters, and everybody time to eat, drink, whatever. You can get reses off if you do it correctly, if for some reason someone dies to, say, a flame strike. But if you have people who are running in and killing 1 whelp before the rest go down, you're going to get them in drips and drabs that are just going to keep you in constant combat and prevent you from really catching a breath. So it's extremely important here that you don't have, basically that solo player mentality of, I'm going to kill a whelp. Don't do it. Let your AoE take it down. It'll be better in the long run.
On them all, and do not let anyone DPS them. The whelps will respawn after they die unless Broodlord is already dead. You want to kill them all at the same time with AoE once you have almost too many on your tank, or when you need to get out of combat to get a quick res off. Have a hunter carefully pull 1 dragon at a time, or 1 group of 3 orcs at a time. For the orcs, simply sheep 2 of them and take them down 1 at a time. For the dragons, be sure to interrupt their flame strikes. You don't have much room to move here, so those can be fatal. Remember to always hug the walls to avoid getting unwanted aggro. When you are at the end of the Suppression Room, you will have to quickly get everyone buffed and powered up while still holding on to some whelps with your main tank. Once you're ready to engage Broodlord, AoE the whelps down and immediately run in.
Okay, so one thing to note here is Broodlord, and I'm not sure if this was inflated for private servers, but I'm fairly certain I remember it on vanilla retail. Broodlord has a very large aggro range. So this corner right here, generally, I would not even be comfortable with like where the bear is right now, because Broodlord had the tendency to just see you and come running. So basically stay out of line of sight of him until the point where you're ready to pull him. just so that no silly mistakes happen.
Determine 2 rogues to get the 2 traps closest to the gate. Those rogues will stay out of combat and only be in charge of the traps. Have your tank stack in the front right corner, your ranged on the other side of the doorway, and the melee need to use line of sight to avoid the AoE. Broodlord does a Mortal Strike effect which reduces healing on the target by 50%. You want your main tank to typically be the one with the highest health. We use an oddball strategy and have a Druid Bear tank, which works well here with their high health pools.
Yeah, so this isn't really an oddball strategy. You see it a lot in TBC, where bear tanks are more viable. Not saying they're not viable in some fights in Classic. But really it comes down to, and I'll just go into this briefly, it comes down to mitigation tanks versus avoidance tanks. Warrior tanks tend to be avoidance tanks, right? They just have more in terms of parry and block. And that's nice for some fights, but for fights like this, where the boss has a strong auto, an instant mortal strike, a cleave, and an AoE, the blast wave, if those things line up, and for some reason you don't dodge or parry one of them, it can just give your tank. It can just kill them. Mitigation tanks, like bears, due to their very high health pool and very high armor, are more likely to be able to take all of those attacks and survive them. So even if the worst case scenario lines up and they get hit with cleave, mortal strike, auto, and blast nova, it is reasonable to expect that they will survive that, whereas that burst is more likely to kill a warrior. So if you do have a strong feral here who can keep the TPS, put them on him. It's your best bet, and really, it's one of the few fights that ferals outperform warriors on, in my opinion. So might as well let them do it. But
This is again a threat-based fight. As long as no one pulls, you should be fine. Do not let the tanks die, melee stay out of the AoE, and do not pull threat, and this should be a breeze compared to the first 2 bosses. For Firemaw, have your range stack right...
Okay, so before we even get into this is going to be a thing for a couple of the upcoming fights. It's here, it is one of the other drakes, I forget, and it's Chromagus. If you position these bosses correctly, your healers should be able to heal the tanks without being in line of sight of the boss. And this is very important because this allows them to avoid the debuff stacking or the breaths or whatever. So here, if this guy's positioned correctly, these healers over here, and I think this guild actually positions the healers on the other side of the wall, which I disagree with. But if you have your healers here, they should be able to target the tank and not be in line of sight for Firemaw so they don't get the stacking debuff. And you can do this for a couple of the bosses. So it takes a bit of learning, but when you can do it reliably, it makes the fight much faster and much less of a headache. So I would suggest trying to learn that.
right outside the doorway, far away but still close enough to DPS the boss and heal the tanks. Have some or all of the tank healers and a melee healer positioned with the melee right around the corner of the doorway, utilizing line of sight with the corner. Tank's positioning is key for this fight. If this is failed, it will be a wipe very quickly. The ranged and melee need to cross into the line of sight safe zones once they get 4+ stacks of the debuff. The debuff will dramatically increase the amount of damage you take from Firemaw. Line of sighting it will allow it to fall off.
Yeah, and this isn't Golemag, alright? This isn't a debuff that you can just kind of go man mode and just eat it. It will kill you, so don't be a hero. Let it drop off.
Position the tanks to the left of the doorway along the wall and gate as shown in the graphic. The off tank needs to tank Firemaw when the main tank gets wing buffeted, until the main tank can taunt him back. Again, knockbacks occur on the tanks here, so positioning is absolutely key. Get positioning down, watch threat and debuff stacks, and you'll be a-okay.
Yeah, these fights are fairly simple.
3 Drakes trash.
Trash is
The
probably
first
harder.
pull is going to consist of Warlocks, a Spellbinder, and an Overseer. The initial pull here is very important. Have a Hunter pull by attacking the Technicians and kiting.
Yeah, and he will say this in a bit here, but after you've killed Broodlord, just go back and clear the suppression room. They won't respawn. And you're going to need the space later for your hunters to kite. He says it in a second here, but I think it's nice to just note right now, before you clear these packs, to just go ahead and do it.
Them. The techs throw bombs every few seconds, but as long as the person they are targeting keeps moving, they will be okay. If someone else takes aggro from the techs, they need to run away from the group so that way they don't get everyone bombed.
Yeah, and when your hunters kite this, it's not enough that they don't get hit by the bombs. They can't be running through the rest of the raid and making other people get hit by bombs. It's a very hunter thing to do. Being like, oh, they haven't touched me, and then half your raid is dead because you've been running through your healers and they've been getting grenaded. So, hunters, remember, not only do they not have to hit you, but they have to not hit you, they can't hit your raid either. You gotta remember that.
For the techs are pulled, have a tank grab both the warlocks and a tank grab the overseer. The range should be focusing on the warlocks first, then AoE the techs down. The warlocks should be focused down ASAP by everyone as they spawn portals which spawn Felguards. Typically you'll get about 2 portals and Felguards per trash pull. The warlocks do Rain of Fire, so have the tank pull them out of it ASAP so that the melee do not sit in it. Once the warlocks are down, make sure your raid warlocks are ready to banish the Felguards. Have the melee move to the spellcaster and, once the techs are AoE down, the ranged can join them on the spellcaster. The spellcaster casts Flame Strike, and even if it looks like it's interrupted, it can't be interrupted. Don't stand in this. Once the techs, warlocks, and spellcaster are down, take care of the overseer and Felguards in whatever order works for you. Again, these trash pulls are very tough and require raid-wide coordination.
Yeah.
Pull carefully. The second pull has Wrathguards and Overseers. Wrathguards and Overseers need to be tanked far away from each other since they do AoE stuns around themselves. Have a hunter or other hunters kite them out of the room through the suppression room. Make sure you've re-cleared this after you've killed Broodlord because nothing will respawn in the suppression room after Broodlord has been killed. Have the raid lead call out when the hunter should feign death and let the mobs come back.
Yeah, so this is exactly like when you kite Dracasath and Ubers. Same thing. Also, I believe it's the Worm Guards that change vulnerabilities to different spells. So this isn't really something the raid leader is going to be doing. It's just as soon as a spell DPS, sees that they're vulnerable to frost or fire or shadow, they just, say a quick thing in Discord, vulnerability frost, and then people switch. It's a large DPS increase to be using the correct spells for their vulnerability, even if you aren't spec'd into that particular spell damage type.
The third through fifth pulls involve warlocks, spellbinders, and overseers. These pulls are very similar to the first pull, except the positioning is also important. Everyone should stay at the bottom of the ramp for the pull unless you are a pulling hunter, a healer, or a tank. The kill order is the same as the first pack, but there are 2 spellbinders for parts of this and 2 overseers as well. The sixth pull is the same as the third through fifth pulls, but on the top platform. Utilize the right hand side cubbies to get the spellbinders to move, which interrupts their flame strikes. The seventh pull is the same as the first pull, except they are all harder hitting worm guards.
Yep.
Kill the goblin first, unless a miner needs to learn to smell elementium, in which case you can mind control the goblin and teach all the miners that spell, then kill him. Once you kill him, you should focus on each of the worm guards one at a time. The worm guards that aren't being attacked should be kited away, similar to how they were by the hunters in the first pull. Once you're ready for a second worm guard, have a hunter feign death, and the third worm guard have the other hunter feign death.
And importantly, you can kite these things all the way back to like the room at the top of Valestraz. It's pretty easy. So obviously it's good if your hunters have some practice kiting, but it's not really that difficult here. So it should be reasonable to expect them to do well at it.
These pulls can be very complicated, so again, exercise caution, but you should be okay. For Evanrock, have the entire raid group start using line of sight behind the ramp, while the main tank pulls Evanrock to the corner. Have your other 2 tanks create a triangle of sorts, with the melee facing directly into the corner. The melee typically either don't have to move at all or move very little to stay behind the Drake, as each tank taunts. Ebonrock casts a curse that causes Ebonrock to heal when he strikes the cursed target. As soon as the tank is cursed, one of the other tanks needs to taunt off of him. The tanks need to wear their Onyxius cloaks for this fight as well. Overall, it is a fairly simple fight. Just make sure your tanks are...
Yeah, this guy's a loot pinata. I mean, if he is hitting people with the curse up, it heals them for like 3-4%, I think. But he shouldn't be. It's a fairly simple mechanic, and this is the easiest of the 3 Drakes.
Are positioned very well here. What else is new? Flamegore is almost the exact same fight as Ebonrock, but he frenzies, so hunters need to be trank shotting him whenever this happens.
This is another fight where if healers are positioned correctly, like around the crook of that ramp, and the tank is positioned correctly with Flamegore in the right spot, the healers can be healing the tank, at least 1 or 2 of the tanks, without being in line of sight of Flamegore. So again, try and figure that out here. There are maps on Google that you can find pretty easily.
3 seconds before the wing buffet, have an off-tank taunt off the main tank.
Yeah.
Only 2 tanks are really needed for this fight, instead of the 3 needed for Ebonrock. This fight's pretty simple as well. You guys should have it. Chromagus. The first thing you need to understand about Chromagus is that he will be slightly different each...
He's not slightly different. He can either be a little different or massively different. So he's right that it's different, but it changes drastically depending on what breaths he has.
Raid ID. This is because there are 2 breaths that he does each week out of a pool of 5. Ignite Flesh is a strong dot. Incinerate does 3.5 to 4.3 thousand damage. Frostburn reduces attack speed by 80% and does about 1.4k damage. Corrosive Acid does about 1k damage every 3 seconds and reduces armor by 4 to 5k. Time Lapse is the tough one. Whoever is hit has their health reduced by 50% and their threat is wiped. Start the fight by having a warlock summon a designated raid member.
Okay, I'm actually
that raid member then goes...
Back this up very slightly. Because the most important part of this fight, well, one of the most important parts, is you see the reticle underneath Chromagus himself. When your tank pulls this, and an additional note is that Chromagus has the largest aggro radius in this raid. He will aggro you from halfway across the room behind this. So again, stay out of line of sight unless you want an accidental pull. But importantly, when you first position Chromagus, he has to be exactly here every time you do it. And this is because all of these healers are going to be able to heal the main tank without getting the breaths. The range DPS can step slightly out DPS and step back in when a breath is coming, but the healers don't have to move for most of this unless you get a time lapse. So it's very, very important that your tank knows exactly where to position him and that the tank is allowed to position him before anything else occurs. If he gets even slightly too far up, he's going to be hitting the healers with every breath he does, and all the range DPS for that matter, and it's very difficult to stutter step him just that little bit to get him where he needs to be. So be very, very precise on that first pull.
About 1k damage every 3 seconds and reduces armor by 4 to 5k. Time Lapse is the tough one. Whoever is hit has their health reduced by 50% and their threat is wiped. Start the fight by having a warlock summon a designated raid member. That raid member then goes and pulls the lever, then immediately takes the summon back to the group. The group should be standing flat against the wall to the left of the doorway. The main tank will grab main aggro, while the off tank will go ahead and build threat while still running out back to the group before the first breath. This fight requires a lot of decursing. The afflictions that go up are all removable except for bronze, which is only removable by the hourglass sand which drops throughout Blackwing Lair.
Okay, so he's about to say that you should allocate your hourglass sands to your tanks first, then your healers, and your hunters. Hunters because they have to trank him. That being said, so for the first probably month of BWL, Hourglass sands are going to be ridiculously expensive. They're obviously not BOP. Um, and although they're not super uncommon, they're not common. So I don't remember precisely, but you can expect anywhere from like 8 to 15 to drop on a run. I mean, if you're lucky, I think probably not even that many. Um, and since you do have to have a couple on the tanks, a couple on the tank healers, and on the hunters, you're going to burn through them pretty quickly. So you have to make the choice with Chromagus. If it is still progress for you, and you get to Chromagus at the end of a night, and you have, say, 10 sands, it might behoove you to call it for the night and come back when everybody's fresh. Fresh mindset, fresh world buffs, importantly. That way, you don't get into a situation where you're, hammering in on Chromagus progression when everybody's tired and they lost their world buffs, and you're slowly whittling down the number of Hourglass Sands that you have to use. When that happens, by the time your raid has actually learned the fight, it's likely that there won't be any Hourglass Sands left, and they're not going to be able to do it anyway. And because of the economy behind Hourglass Sands, it's unlikely or not very feasible that you're going to be able to buy a lot of them, especially because the guilds that are selling them are going to be charging a ton, and most guilds that are actually pushing for progress aren't going to sell them at all. With that, I'll be right back in about 2 minutes. All right. Sorry. Lots of coffee while doing a video. Probably not the greatest idea. And the final note on Hourglass Sands is that if you are a more casual guild, a dad guild, whatever you want to call it, and you are unlikely to be clearing Chromagus in the first month, a choice you might want to make as a guild is to sell your Hourglass Sands, set up a deal with actual progression guilds to be selling them. It's a lot of money in the first month. They're going to get cheaper as more and more people are clearing Blackwing Lair, and the number of Hourglass Sands needed to beat Chromagus go down. And it's a lot of gold that you can put towards, your main tank's Thunder Fury or Nightfalls or whatever you might need as a guild. Again, this is a personal choice from the guild, like command structure, I guess, but it is a viable option if it's unlikely you're going to be clearing Chromagus quickly. So just think about it.
This sand should be used sparingly by the tanks, healers, and hunters. Mages, druids, and paladins need to be decursing the entire fight, and the entire raid should be using restorative potions. If anyone gets to 5 afflictions, they will transform into a dragonkin and wipe the raid.
It will yeet everyone.
If there is no time lapse at the first breath, after the first breath, have all the melee and a few decursors run into the cubby to the left of Chromagus. They should be using this cubby as line of sight to avoid getting hit by any breaths. If you have Bronze Affliction, be sure to run into the corner when there is about 10 seconds until the next breath, in case you get Bronze stunned. If the first breath is time lapse, the off tank needs to immediately grab Chromagus while the main tank avoids the breath, then handing Chromagus back to the main tank after the breath is over. If there is a time lapse in general, everyone must stay out of the safe spots and get affected by time lapse. I repeat, everyone has to get affected by time lapse if that is one of your breaths every time it happens. This ensures that the threat stays with who it needs to stay with. Hunters will...
Yeah, okay, so this isn't just about, one person misses time lapse, doesn't get hit by it, Chromagus goes and eats him. If that were all this was, it wouldn't be the end of the world. Still wouldn't be ideal, but it wouldn't be, raid breaking. The reason this is so important is because of the positioning required on Chromagus. If one of the ranged on that back wall don't get hit by time lapse, Chromagus comes around the corner, chomps him, and then the breath ends. The tank then has to do this whole involved process of getting Chromagus dragged back to the correct spot, reset so he's not breathing on healers, and by the time that's happened, there's probably going to be another breath. So if you don't get hit by the breath here, it's not that you're going to die, it's that you're going to die and then you're probably going to kill the whole raid. So it's extremely important, it cannot be emphasized enough, that when he does a bronze breath or time stop, you need to be hit by it. Everybody. Also, the tank needs to be topped off because obviously they will have no avoidance and everybody will be stunned, so they're not going to be taking any heals. So those are two things. But yeah.
Will need to be constantly knowing a rotation of tranquilizer shots so that Chromagus never stays frenzied. At 20%, he will enter a secondary frenzy, which is not trankable, but also will have the typical frenzies happen, which still need to be trank shotted. He will hit much harder at 20%, so be sure you time it right around the easier of the two breaths for your raid to handle. He will hit much harder at 20%, so be sure your time is right so you get the easier of the two breaths for your raid to handle. Also keep in mind that he switches vulnerabilities similar to the Overseers and Worm Guards from before, so casters should be using this to their advantage.
Yep. Again,
this fight sounds complicated, but as long as decursing is on point, healers watch the tanks, and the hunters trank, you should have this.
Tanks should save, obviously, most of their cooldowns for when he hits 20%. And if you're Alliance and you have a Paladin spec'd into improved lay on hands, which is nice, or if you have a Red Paladin who can spec into it for the raid, have them blow that on the tank right before he hits 20%. The armor buff certainly helps, especially if he's got the corrosive breath, which the corrosive breath plus the enrage can deal a lot of damage to your tanks. So just do everything you can to shore them up for that last final push. And then also your DPS should be saving their cooldowns to get him from 20% to 0 as fast as possible, which obviously they should still be doing in terms of execute phase and stuff, but everybody should be doing that.
Nefarian. First, you're going to want to split the odd and even groups as evenly as possible in regards to how much DPS each side can do.
How much DPS and what type of DPS. You're going to need to split your physical DPS fairly evenly across both sides. He doesn't talk about this, I don't believe, but the different Draconids, they all do different things. And just off the top of my head, the red Draconid does a frontal cone that applies a dot. The black Draconid does an ignite flesh that is just a flat boom. Everybody gets hit by damage. Blue Draconid, I believe, drains mana and slows. The green Draconid does a War Stomp ability. The bronze Draconid, I believe, casts slow. And chromatic Draconids basically can't be damaged by spells whatsoever. So when a chromatic Draconid spawns, all the melee DPS need to hard switch to it and kill it, because they're not going to be getting any help from their casters. Additionally, each of the other colored Draconids have resistances to certain spell types based on their color, and you can look that up pretty easily. So,
for example, don't put all your strongest DPS on one side.
yeah.
Everyone should have a greater shadow protection potion used before the fight starts. After speaking to Nefarian, the gates on the south and west sides of the room will begin having Draconoids come out of them. Ensure hunters use a few frost traps to slow down the adds in case they aggro onto the ranged. The ranged need to be stacked on the corner of the pillars. Nefarian will be porting around the room and using Shadow Bolt, hence the greater shadow protection potions. Ranged need to move in order to line of sight Nefarian Shadow Bolt. These will continue to spawn until 42 have been summoned. As soon as chromatic draconoids come out, all the melee need to switch to them immediately.
Yes, so he does mention it.
Use your cooldowns during Phase 1. Regardless of how fast you kill the adds, they come out at the same rate, and they come out fast. They need to go down immediately. About 10 seconds before the adds will stop spawning, Nefarian will come down in his dragon form. There will still be adds up. The tank needs to grab him and move him to the center of the balcony, facing towards the balcony. Heals need to keep the tank alive while everyone finishes off the adds. Nefarian will do fears. Melee can avoid these fears by using line of sight behind the broken pillar to Nef's back right. He will also do class calls. These can be seen on the screen now. Mages must...
I don't think he actually puts them up here. I'm just going to run through the class calls real quick. Again, there are a list of these online. Find them. I'm going to describe each one quickly, but you can obviously brush up yourselves. So priest class call, your direct heals apply basically like a negative renew, like a dot on the tank. These get pretty hefty, or they blind anyone you obviously heal. These get pretty hefty and they stack. So if you get 2 or 3 onto a person, onto your tank specifically, it's likely they're gonna die. So when this happens, priests need to swap to bubbling or renewing people. They need to be very aware of this because this can kill tanks. Rogues will be teleported in front of Nefarian and rooted. They need to pop evasion. I don't remember whether or not Vanish breaks the root. I know for a fact that improved sprint does. So if you have that, use it. But yeah, it's a fairly simple one. Mages will begin casting Greater Polymorph on whoever they can see. So when class call is about to go out, they should just step behind and line of sight everyone else, especially the healers. Warlocks summon Infernals. Warriors will be forced into Berserker stance, he does say this one, and trapped there, so the tanks will start taking a lot more damage, and their threat will not be as high for that period. Druids will be forced into cat form. Shaman make him start summoning totems, which can be targeted and should be targeted and killed. They're called like corrupted totems, and they have something like 2,000 health. I think some of them are even lower than that. They can be single targeted and just burst it down. They need to be, because they can give them Wind Fury. Paladins will bop Nefarian, and Hunters, yours sucks. So when the Hunter class call is called, he will break your ranged weapon, just flat out. So ideally, what you want to do is you want to have backups that you swap to before the class call hits, and then swap back to your main weapon after it's hit. So the easiest ones to get are going to be the bow from Alterac Valley if you kept it, or Carapace Spine Crossbows from Stratholme. It's unlikely you're going to get hit by more than 2 of these in any one Nefarian, but if you're doing multiple Nefarian pulls, it does help to have a number of them in your bags. I know bag space is already light, but it's better than having your, primary ranged weapon broken, like your Rockjalar or whatever. I believe that's all of them. So yeah, again, look at the list for this. The most important ones are probably the Hunter one, the Mage one, and the Priest one. But just keep an eye out for them.
Must always be out of line of sight to the healers and tanks, especially right before a class call.
Yeah.
Rogues can use Vanish to move from the class call or Evasion to avoid
Vanish
being
does
killed.
do it.
Warlock Infernals should be dealt with immediately during their call. Warrior Call means big heals on the tank. At 20%, Nefarian will spawn a massive amount of undead Draconoids from the gates during Phase 1. I advise having Hunters put down frost traps at each door around 23%. Also, I wouldn't push past 20% if you are currently experiencing a Priest
very
or
much
Mage
agreed.
class call. Everyone needs to AoE these ads down ASAP, while also having the healers keep the tank alive. This is where a lot of wipes happen. Your mages, warlocks, and other AoE classes will be vital here. You can use Stratholme Holy Water to AoE here as well if you wish. Once those are dead, it's pretty much the same as it was before he hit 20%. If you've made it this far, you can do this. Congratulations.
Yeah, so that's the fight, basically. Another thing that should be common sense, everyone has to wear an Nyxia scale cloak for that fight. Unlike the Drakes, where you just really need them on tanks, Nefarian will hit the whole raid with Shadow Flame. So everyone needs to have one. Technically, Shadow Flame can be healed through, but it's a massive amount of healing that shouldn't need to happen, so just wear your cloak. Those are the fights. There is a single pack, I believe one pack, between Veilistraz and the suppression room, which wasn't covered or shown. Those, importantly, notes there is that they can be hibernated by druids, so use that to your advantage, and just keep a couple of them CC'd while you kill the rest. It's an easy pack. But on a more general note, BWL, while not terribly difficult, is decidedly more difficult than MC. I mean, everything is. And generally what happens at the end of every raid tier is that you have burnout, you have people getting bored, and importantly, recruitment dries up. And then the first few weeks of a new raid tier, you have people bricking on bosses and just hitting the wall. A lot of them will disband or lose players. So, sounds kind of terrible to say, but if you are an officer or a guild leader, the first few weeks of every new raid tier, be on the lookout, because you're going to see a lot of potential recruits coming in, and it can really help your raid roster. The important thing to note is that unless you are like a tier 1 guild, just take your time. Especially if you are cruising through MC, the faster you are going, the harder it's going to feel when you hit a wall and actually have to start working to progress in MC. So don't, prepare your guildies for it, prepare yourself for it. Don't get totally disheartened or demoralized the first time you actually have to push through something. It's going to happen, if not now, then in AQ, and definitely in Nax. So just go in with reasonable expectations. The other thing, and this is spoken about in other guides, and I can do a video about this if necessary, but Blackwing Lair loot is such, it's such drama. There are some pieces that are just so insanely good, Rejuvenating Gem, Drakefang Talisman, that if you have anybody who is predisposed to loot drama, you're going to see it in full force in Blackwing Lair. And unless you keep a tight lid on it, it's going to spread. There are pieces in there that are just like a match in a powder keg. So be prepared for that. Be very clear about your loot rules heading into it. MC, it's not as bad with loot. I mean, they're brag loot for some people, but nothing to the level of what Blackwing Lair is going to bring. Other than that, I hope this helped. Again, I think this video was fantastic. I just wanted to elaborate and kind of embellish here and there where I thought some things were glossed over. But yeah, so good luck in Blackwing Lair, and I hope you get all the purples you desire. See you next time.